wording offered by the former Intelligence and Security Coordinator at the Cabinet Office, Sir David Omand, who said, David put it, the ultimate object of intelligence is to enable action to be optimized by reducing ignorance. So the purpose of secret intelligence is to achieve this objective in respect to the information that other people want to remain hidden. Intelligence collection generally is very different from any other function of a democratic state, because most of what's going on is secret. Accordingly, some citizens have certain problems, difficulties reconciling democratic ideals and goals, not to mention some moral principles, with the realities of intelligence, like spying, eavesdropping, covert action, honey traps, and other things. I remember our recent discussion in Vai's site of whether Edward Snowden and his revealing some of the United States government secrets can be in any way justified. I believe those who support Mr. Snowden forget that the basic principle is that intelligence agencies exist for a major reason: to avoid strategic surprise. Whether it comes to national security, it is always the more authorities know about the imminent threat, the better, and the less we know about what they know is often better for us. It's already an established fact today, coming to signal intelligence, that the superpower of this century is the one that is capable to intercept and read digital communications. Therefore, a country that possesses signal intelligence facilities is really the leader in this world, or at least in this century. I will talk about the United States and Britain, of course, in this respect. In its work, every intelligence agency encounters three major problems normally. First, of course, is the intelligence collection itself, which is a very costly and time-consuming business. Second problem is intelligence assessment, assessment of raw intelligence. Although conclusions, the final results, normally a result of collective wisdom, it is normally understood that what an intelligence analyst is painting is rather the impressionism, which lacks the precision of a photographic image. But whatever the result, the third difficulty is to bring intelligence to the attention of a decision maker. From history, we remember that certain political leaders, like Margaret Thatcher, were very fond of guessing political assessments, while others, like Churchill or Stalin, for example, preferred raw intelligence. And we remember that Stalin did not believe reports of his intelligence agents, officers, and other sources about Hitler's upcoming imminent attack on the Soviet Union. Completely ignored this information. Today, of course, awareness is becoming more acute, but rarely can it be said that secret intelligence is a decisive factor in political decision making. On the other hand, if we take recent deaths or murders of several Russian dissidents in London in the past few years, and the British government decision to conceal facts about all those cases, we shall see that secret intelligence does play a certain role in political decision making. We all remember the Litvinenko case, and I can tell you that in the inquest hearing about 2 days ago, they started again considering only technicalities, because the British government forbade considering any participation of the Russian state in the murder of Litvinenko, which is an obvious fact. And the inquest judge had only to say that after analyzing all the documents pertinent to the case, he came to the absolute conclusion that that was the Russian intelligence operation. There is no doubt about it. You know that in the recent case of, to my mind, murder of another famous Russian exile, Boris in London in March this year, it still remains a mystery, and the government does not release any information at all pertaining to this case, while it is clear to everybody who knew Boris, and I knew him personally rather well, that he could not have committed suicide, and this is absolutely clearly the case of murder. But the government reasons in the case of Berezovsky to conceal the truth from the public are, to my mind, different as in the Litvinenko case. And if we have time, we shall come to it later. It's no secret that intelligence community collects information about economic and financial matters. As Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, puts it, we collect this information for many important reasons. For once, it could provide the United States and our allies early warning of international financial crisis, which could negatively impact the global economy. The intelligence community's efforts to understand economic system and policies and monitor anomalous economic activities is critical to providing policymakers with the information they need to make informed decisions that are in the best interests of our national security. The same can be said about any other intelligence agency. In the industrial production, we remember that secret intelligence is, of course, very important because, like in the case with atomic secrets, in the early 40s and in the middle of the Second World War, Russia was able to save hundreds of millions of dollars, and if not months, if not years, but months of extensive labor, getting the atomic bomb from the intelligence secrets that were collected in the United States and in Britain by its agents. And the information was very precise. That goes on all the time, and we remember that last year 14 Russians were facing charges for illegally selling United States technology for Russian military intelligence agencies, in what became known, as you remember, as Arc Electronica case. Nowadays, economic and industrial espionage are complemented with what became known as competitive intelligence, which is described as systematic gathering, analyzing, and managing information on individual competitors. As a rule, normally this information is received from open sources, and it's being practiced by private intelligence companies and sometimes big corporations and insurance companies. Interesting, in what concerns business secrets, secret intelligence men may sometimes play a negative role. 4 years ago, I was involved on a fact-funding mission in several countries like Azerbaijan, United States, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and the Bahamas. And the case was we were to find proof that a certain American billionaire who was an investor in Azerbaijan was not guilty as accused within the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And we did a very good job, collected rather proving evidence that he was not to blame and he did not commit any crime within the FCPA, but the defense team decided not to produce this evidence and this information to the court because they thought it's a bit too complex, too difficult, and they decided to play on technicalities. And the billionaire lost the case. He got 1 year in prison, fortunately. So in this case, the secret intelligence that we collected was completely ignorant, and so that was the case. Another interesting business case is probably what you all know. It's the Magnitsky case. I hope you heard about Sergei Magnitsky and the Magnitsky Act, which was signed into law in December last year by President Obama. The interest is that in considering the case, the American lawmakers completely ignored any secret intelligence if it was presented to them, which I doubt very much. The case looks like, as presented by its chief actor, Bill Browder, is as if his 3 companies were stolen in Russia, taken over by a group of gangsters, criminals. Then charges were filed against those companies in arbitration courts, and then they asked for tax rebate and the tax rebate in the amount of $230 million was transferred to certain private accounts and disappeared. That's their version. They accused this group and a group of another 60 Russian officials of being involved in the arrest and imprisonment of what the press calls the human rights lawyer who was involved in the investigation of the cases connected to Mr. Browder, Sergei Magnitsky, and then later of killing him in prison. They said he was tortured and killed in prison, and that became probably one of the biggest human rights cases of this century and came into law. And after the law was adopted, you know probably that 18 Russian officials were banned from coming to the United States. Their property was confiscated here and worldwide, and they said that in the list connected to the Magnitsky case there's about another 240 names of Russian officials. As a countermeasure, Russia took the anti-Magnitsky law, and about 200 US officials are now banned from coming into Russia. The case is, I can't give you all the facts because these are reflections on secret intelligence, not revelations. But the case is quite different. The thing is that, first of all, there were much bigger sums involved than these $230 million. Second, interestingly, no one found this $230 million nowhere. Somehow, quite miraculously, they were transferred to one small private Russian bank, and from this bank disappeared. Then the bank disappeared. The owner of the bank lives in Moscow openly, and there's no problem. That has no problem at all with prosecution with anybody else. These $200 million were not from Mr. Browder's companies, by the way. They were from the Russian treasury, and this is very strange that no prosecutors, nobody, just cared about these $200 million, while in reality it was about $1 billion, and very many companies were involved in this, and money completely disappeared. As the competitive intelligence showed, that means the open sources, in reality, the operation started in August 1998 when Mr. Putin was appointed director of the FSB, which is the Russian Internal Security Service. At that moment, 4.8 billion of the International Monetary Fund money disappeared completely, but at that time certain people believed that that was to save Russia and its secret services. After the year 2000, when President Putin became the president of Russia, that was to form special black accounts of the Kremlin that could have been used by a very small group of people in the Kremlin and by the secret services. As you know, in reality, Magnitsky was not a human rights lawyer. Magnitsky was an auditor who was employed by the company called Firestone Duncan that was helping Bill Browder make more money in Russia and save on good knowledge of tax law and the Russian laws. Like, for example, the company is relieved from taxes in Russia if it employs over 50% of its staff of disabled people, of invalids. So what was done? They registered companies where there were 2 invalids and Mr. Browder. Automatically more than 50% were physically unable people, so they were free from tax. Or otherwise, for example, Russian companies are obliged to pay withholding tax of 15% on the dividends and 20% on all other payments. So all foreign transfers that were made were presented to the tax authorities as payment of interest on loans from shareholders, and this is taxed at 5%. With $4 billion under management, under personal management of Bill Browder in Russia in the year 2006, knowledge of these financial tricks could bring very, very considerable sums of money. I believe you know that Bill Browder is the son of Earl Browder, the former General Secretary of the American Communist Party. I don't know whether you know or not that his father was a fully fledged agent of the Stalin secret police, and that the whole Browder family worked for Stalin's secret police in Europe for a very long time, all members. So when Bill Browder came to Russia in 1999, he was very much welcome, of course, and he was a great supporter of President Putin at the time, advising the presidential administration. And in 2003, he was applauding the arrest and incarceration of the founder of Yukos Oil, Michael Khodorkovsky. But then, later in 2006, he started to buy shares of important Russian companies like Gazprom. First of all, they were not forbidden to buy to foreign investors. Secondly, they were allowed to buy these shares only on the New York and London stock exchanges. He brought other problems to the Russian companies, and started acting against leading Russian businesses that were important for the Kremlin. So the Federal Security Service was given instruction to quiet him, and by 2009 he stopped doing any business in Russia. And he was forbidden to come to the country, by the way. His lawyers began to investigate and found out that money were flowing out of Russia. But they presented it as if an honest investor came, his loyal lawyer wanted to help him, so they were revenged by a group of criminals. In 2002, Magnitsky started to investigate, was filing complaints with the authorities, and started talking to the press, and they asked him for interrogation several times for interviews. He refused, so he was really arrested. Several days ago, I was reading the last report, a 75-page report of what happened in the pre-trial facility where he was where he died. And I'm inclined to believe the Russian, which I don't normally do, the official version of the Russian government that he died of natural causes. So, of course, we know that conditions in the Russian prisons are horrific. But there was no beating, quite certainly no beating. There was no torture, as claimed by Browder's team, though this case does not become less tragic because of that. But people do die in prison sometimes, and that does not make huge international scandals between countries when the government of Russia is opposing the United States government and vice versa. It doesn't happen. It seems that Mr. Magnitsky died for the wrong cause. I think so. Mr. Browder's lawyers principally refused to hire professional intelligence analysts or investigators to make intelligence assessment of what was going on in reality, and they preferred present the case entirely in the interests of Browder, who in this case, to my mind, wanted a revenge, and it was a problem for him, business problem, because he lost growing business which progressed from $50 million initially to $4 billion under his command. But that was the case. So we talked about this operation. In reality, the operation was carried out by Russian secret services, and the money first were officially placed by bank transfers into the financial system. It's called placement. Then complex financial transactions through many foreign accounts are being carried out to camouflage the source, which is called layering. And then funds are either accumulated on black accounts, and we all know that these accounts are in Switzerland, in Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, in Britain, British Virgin Islands, and until recent time in Cyprus. And then they're invested in real estate. And I was absolutely shocked to know how many wonderful historic palaces in Vienna, for example, belong to people, hotels, leading hotels, 5-star, 6-star hotels. Yeah, it's not laundering. It's not laundering. It's a sort of investment, and then the money, they can be sold, and the money become legal. Yes, this is laundering, but from the very beginning they were more or less legal. So it's fascinating how many secret accounts with billions and billions of dollars are in Switzerland today. How much money go through these channels and disappear abroad. But they can be commanded by a small group of people and a very large network of people, primarily Russian businessmen, or people who live here permanently or travel here. They control certain small elements of these operations. Then money goes through them and disappear. And we talk about billions of dollars, and nobody sees that. Nobody sees that operations. And so the Hermitage companies were only part of this big scam, which unfortunately the legal team refused to understand. In the past few years, as you know, they produced many films, many newspaper articles. It was in all world media under the title "Stop the Untouchables," to promote their version of events. I don't know whether you know or not, but as a result, today in London there's a court lawsuit brought against William Browder and his Moscow lawyers by a former Moscow police investigator who was accused of tax fraud, of arresting and killing Mr. Magnitsky in prison. And I can assure you that if the judge ever permits to hear the case, Mr. Browder will certainly lose that. Now let us move to the final part, perhaps the most important part of this address, which can be entitled Assessing the Academic Literature, or simply Secret Intelligence and Academic Literature. When I started working on the biography of Alexander Orlov 13 years ago, which finally comes out this year in Oxford University Press, I have noticed that apart from specialized literature dealing exclusively with intelligence history or intelligence matters, other academic books, especially published in the past century, that is, in the 20th century, and even in the first decade of this century, prefer to ignore secret intelligence and even the fact of its existence. Nowadays, many academic historians acknowledge the significance of intelligence, realizing that they cannot ignore it in their studies. However, until recently, the activities and role of intelligence services behind different important events of the world history that were reflected in the world media are surrounded by speculation, and those accounts that do or did appear are full of factual errors. The explanation is simple, of course. Espionage is a secretive business. It's rare, as the authors of the recently published book on the rise and rise of the KGB in America put it, it is rare that the agents engaged in it, or the agencies that they serve, speak honestly and openly about what they have done, because the incentive to lie, dissemble, and continue to deceive are so strong for all concerned. In this connection, the comparatively comprehensive official histories of British secret intelligence, which was published in 2009 and written by an eminent British professor, Christopher Andrew, The Defense of the Realm, and the history of British Foreign Intelligence Service, MI6, written by Keith Jeffrey and published in 2007, are, of course, a very important breakthrough and should remain handbooks for everybody who has to do with this historic period. And we know that they cover 1909-1949. Working on the biography of Orlov, I was struck by my own discovery that for several decades our knowledge of clandestine Soviet activities during the Spanish Civil War, for example, was based on the writings of two former Soviet intelligence operators, Alexander Orlov and Walter Krivitsky, who has never visited Spain and took no part in any operation regarding to the Spanish Civil War. And also since 1993, on the book which was authored by an acting KGB officer and a British journalist. The title of the book is Deadly Illusions. It's based on the archive material compiled by the KGB archivists and approved by the service. And my conclusion that you shall see in the book, in my book, which was published in July this year in Barcelona and called El Caso Orlov, and part of it will be published in Oxford in December, proves quite definitely that this is a disinformation campaign. It was, and it is probably, in every university and highly recommended while in reality should be taken away from any libraries, because this is a clear disinformation. You probably don't know that the KGB was paid $1 million by the publisher in '93 for publishing this book, and this is all based on completely false facts. This is no wonder, of course, because the whole purpose of governments, of every government, is not to document, but to hide the facts related to the secret activities, while the access to the primary sources, especially in Russia, it was and still remains very limited. One example concerns the history of signal intelligence. That's what we started. It's known among the professionals as SIGINT. At the beginning we mentioned Snowden, and it seems that the positive side of Snowden's revelations is that we know more about some modern day operations of the National Security Agency, that we know about its old successes. Even after the revelation of the Ultra operation in 1973, it took another 15 years before any historian raised the rather obvious question of whether there was Russian Ultra, and if yes, when it began. At the same time, the British interception operation, which is called MASK, which began before the Spanish Civil War and continues during the war, is practically not covered in literature at all. Its very small part is given in Nigel West's book, which is called MASK, but its Spanish operation, entire Spanish operation, is only shown in the book that was published, in my book that was published recently. While we know that the main British interception center for Spain was in Gibraltar, and that was a critical site for surveillance of Spanish communications. Unfortunately, it's not even mentioned in the official history of MI6 that was published in 2010. At the same time, during the Civil War, the British obtained detailed daily updates on the situation in the conflict, and the author of a recently published book on the subject describes the breadth of information received by Royal Air Force alone as encyclopedic. So the intelligence service knew absolutely everything of what was going on since 1935, and the fact that no one knew about the prepared putsch is a legend. This is simply not true. It's now known that everything was known to the British intelligence. Since March 35 it was known to French intelligence, and when it was known to the British intelligence, because Donald Maclean was there at the Foreign Office and cipher clerks worked there since 32, 34, 35, all this information was coming to Moscow as well, so Moscow was equally well informed about what was planned in Spain and what was going on in Spain. Of course, we now know about the Spanish Civil War much better and much more thanks to publications by Paul Preston, Angel Venus, Richard Baxell and other authors. But it is difficult to think of any work which devotes as much as a sentence to the volume and quality of signal intelligence generated by the NKVD and the military intelligence, the GIU, during and before the Spanish Civil War. At the same time, my research shows that the Red Army alone sent over 100 wireless operators and signal intelligence specialists and 54 code clerks to Spain. There is even less known, less secret intelligence in the most recent books, either in Russia or in the West, on Stalin and his inner circle. It is difficult to imagine, really, because you would say about, again, hundreds of books that are published about Stalin, his time, the situation, the Kremlin, the authorities, the Foreign Office, etc. But in reality, there's no information of the processes that were going on the decision-making behind the Kremlin walls. This could be understood concerning the period of 1923-1943, when there was no any highly placed source, in spite of all accusations about hundreds, if not thousands of people shot during the Great Terror time and accused of being British, American, French and German spies. I have studied all archives of MI5 and the interwar period, international archives, and I can confirm that the British really not to say about Americans who didn't have intelligence service at the time, the British did not have any source, any reliable or highly placed source in Moscow in this time. During the war, even triplex, a code word that refers to an exceptionally secret and sensitive British intelligence operation, could not deliver information about Moscow's intentions or decision making. Starting from 1943 and during the initial period of the Cold War, the Venona project was an important source of information, but only on Soviet intelligence gathering activities in this country and in Britain. We don't know what was going on, how ideas were formed, how the decision making worked at Stalin's government and in the Stalin's Kremlin at the time. Remarkably, as late as in 1949, a production conference in the London CIS headquarters noted that the ban continues on clandestine operations of any kind in Moscow. I can tell you that, as shown in my Orlov biography, during this time, that is starting from 1934 and until actually 1954, in London alone there were 250 secret Soviet agents, many of them extremely highly placed. And this is not to mention hundreds and hundreds in this country. In most of the cases we do not know what secret intelligence they delivered, how it was assessed, and who had access to it. But we know that they were very highly placed sources, and we know that the CIS station in Moscow, this is MI6 station in Moscow, was not allowed to do any secret work. And perhaps the lack of literature or knowledge on this is because of the lack of actual intelligence, which illustrates the immense difficulty, as it was said, faced by any intelligence organization seeking to penetrate the Soviet Union during Stalin's time. After Stalin it was a little bit easier, but still remained a very difficult task for all intelligence services. Back to the academic literature. In one of the old articles, Professor Paul Preston mentioned the bibliography of the Spanish Civil War literature, and at that time it was created by Ricardo La Sierra, a very famous Franca historian, and so at that time it was 15,000 volumes. After 30 years it is perhaps about 100,000 volumes. But what I cannot understand is how could all those books have been written without taking into account Soviet, British, French, German and Italian clandestine activities in Spain, about which, I dare say, most of the authors know absolutely nothing. So the volume of most of those volumes about the Spanish Civil War that were published starting from 1936, the value of these volumes is decreasing from year to year, I would say. How can we write about, we discussed that with John, for example, how can we write about Latin American events in 1935 and about the attempt for a state revolt against the president, when nothing at all is known about the activities of the Comintern at that time there, and specifically about British espionage activities there. And it was the British spy among the Comintern delegation who could turn things around and who warned the government about the upcoming communist revolt. Not knowing this, it is absolutely impossible neither to teach or to write anything about this. And this is exactly secret intelligence that is involved in academic literature. In several Western studies of Soviet foreign policy, the KGB is barely mentioned. Professor Andrew noted that bibliography of a recent academic history of Soviet foreign relations from 1917 to 1993, published in 1998, praised by a British authority on the subject as in quotation, easily the best general history on Soviet foreign policy, contains, apart from a biography of Beria, the head of the Stalin secret police at the time, not a single work on Soviet intelligence and among more than 120 titles. One may add that a recently published volume of another British authority on the Russian history entitled Spies and Commissars. In the chapter about Soviet agents does not mention a single name of a Soviet agent, though such aberrations by leading historians are due partly to the overclassification of intelligence archives, especially in Russia. They derive at root from what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the difficulty all of us sometimes have in grasping new concepts that disturb our existing view of the world. This dissonance is well demonstrated in yet another work of the British historian whose History of Modern Russia, published in 2003, mentions the Spanish Civil War on one page only, or actually in 2 paragraphs only, writing that Stalin instructed his emissaries to conduct the same bloody terror against the Trotskyists, anarchists, and others that Stalin was applying to them in the USSR. Thousands of anti-fascist fighters, he writes, were arrested and executed at the behest of Soviet functionaries, which, as all experts on the Spanish Civil War know, is simply not true. This book was also praised as a remarkable work of scholarship and synthesis, and is highly recommended to students, and I am sure that all history students who study Spanish Civil War take it as one of their basic works on the study of the Soviet Union. Even when books are written by Western intelligence professionals and are entirely devoted to espionage, one often finds total lack of intelligence analysis, assessment of the political situation, or even simple understanding of backstage processes. Or otherwise, slightly paraphrasing the words of Alfred Rosmer, the authors are educated, well-informed men, capable of making brilliant analysis, but not of coming to conclusions, not even of formulating the logical conclusions of their analyses. And I hope that the new generation of historians and academics, less disoriented than their predecessors by the influence of intelligence and its use or abuse by policymakers, concentrate more efforts on intelligence studies. With this, I well remember the words once said by the Duke of Cambridge, whose statue stays in London in front of the Old War Office. There is a time for everything, he said, and the time for change is when you can no longer help it. To my mind, it's high time to come to terms with reality. Thank you very much. Any questions, please?
Thank you very much. My novel idea, let's take a couple of questions, and then our lunch has been outside for half an hour or longer, and what we could do is continue our conversation while we eat.
Correct.
So we can start the afternoon session
please.
on time.
Boris, thank you very much for that very much light
Thank you.
presentation. I wonder if I may ask you a question. Maybe, I'm directly related to your topic, but it's a straightforward question. Do we know already if finally the reigning Soviet spy ring inside Germany, the Volodarsky, and looking in Switzerland and wherever, and linking to all that, finally Martin Bormann was really a Soviet agent?
No. We know all about the Rosa Capella, the Red Orchestra in Switzerland and in France and Belgium, of course. In England and other countries in America, it was a very huge network, actually. No, Martin Bormann was not a Soviet agent. He was not hidden by the Soviets. No, it's all legend. No, it's proved completely. We know he was not. Yes. Very interesting. The Cold War History Project in Yale University was very interesting to my mind. It is very strange that they were publishing good books alongside bad books as usual. and one book was especially harmful for the historiography of the Spanish Civil War, which is called Spain Betrayed by Rados and others, because that presented a group of rather valuable secret documents on the Spanish Civil War, but was accompanied by comments which were absolutely out of context and were simply wrong, historically speaking. So whoever wanted to study to read this book, if he could separate himself by reading documents, by the way, the translations were very bad. I'm referring to very many of those documents in the book. The translations were bad, the sources were questionable because they were not permitted to operate freely in the archives, and several GIO archives, military intelligence, were closed at the time, so they were stealing, buying, like that, transporting these documents by various channels to the West. So this book is really rather more harmful than useful for the Spanish Civil War. The project in itself, to my mind, was quite interesting. Yes, sir.
My area, primarily, essentially, and right after the Soviet Revolution, when they went back between the Russian Empire, it was a particularly vicious, violent, between 1918 particularly violent, particularly vicious struggle on both sides, and also got citizens of White Russia. All kinds of things.
Yeah.
Is there anything that the GRU have that came out, any studies you know
No.
that deal with this period?
Yes, everything is known, absolutely everything, and you can find that in a brilliant volume by Christopher Andrew with Vasily Mitrokhin, of course, that covers the whole period. There are other books, a few books appeared in Russia. Yeah, everything is known about this period. The GIU at the time, and that was not the GIU, that was RU, Intelligence Department of the Red Army. They did not operate in Russia at all at the time. They operated in the West, and the priorities were different. But anyway, it's all very well known. Yeah.
It's just like,
Yeah.
like you get a person like Enver Pasha who tricks Stalin into, you know.
But this has been known since 1930, because there was a Russian defector named Georgy Agabekov who was in charge of all these operations there, and he wrote a book and published it in Paris in 1930. So since that time, it's in English, French, and German. So since that time, more or less everything was known about that.
Quick question. My question has to do with the 3 points that you brought up about the nature of intelligence collection and assessment, and then getting that intel to the decision makers, and particularly the last item on it, getting intel. I'm familiar with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 77 and 81, and I suspect there's been an updated revision. I don't know, I haven't followed that close. I don't know, perhaps it's been applied to Walmart in Mexico as a case of bribery, and China is trying to clean up bribery amongst its executives and business people. And then my question is, how does for lack of good investigative journalism in rooting out these situations, how does a situation of bribery, bakshish, how does it, which from your presentation sounds like it's been institutionalized in countries, how does it flip from being a secret or an open secret to a court case?
Investigative journalism is entirely different from the work of security and intelligence agencies, and it cannot be paralleled because the intelligence and security agencies are using all methods, and investigative journalists is only permitted to use legal methods, and there's great difference. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much. Really.